Well, hello and a very warm welcome along to Real Israel. It's great to be here with you once again. My name is Paul Alster. I'm a broadcast journalist based here in Israel, covering news and sports issues. And I'm delighted that through Real Israel, I'm able to begin a series of conversations with some of the most prominent figures in Israel across a whole myriad of fields. And my very first guest in this series is Nazi hunter extraordinaire Efraim Zuroff, who joins us from the Sam Wiesenthal offices in Jerusalem. Efraim, it's great to see you as always.
Great to see you. Great to have a conversation.
There's always plenty to talk about, and I'm very interested to chat to you about your book, Our People, which has caused such a stir over the last year or so, year or two. But before I go there, I want to just come to something that's out more or less today, because you wrote a very interesting piece in the Times of Israel talking about the issue surrounding Efie Tam, who was nominated to be the head of Yad Vashem, and that's something that troubles you from what I read.
Yes, I'm very troubled. I think he's definitely not the right person for this job. He's a person who has had a very, in a certain sense, glorious but troubled military career. Has proven his dedication to the IDF and has, served with great distinction in several wars, but at the same time has been very controversial because of questionable statements really that indicate a certain lack of sensitivity and a lack of tolerance towards non-Jews and in this case, Palestinians or Arabs. At one point, he called to expel the Arab representatives in the Knesset. I don't think he means every Arab representative. I mean, he means the ones who espouse the Palestinian cause, which of course is a problem, but they were elected fairly, and obviously they should not be expelled. And at one point, he suggested that the majority of the Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria would have to be expelled. Again, something that is simply unthinkable for a person who's going to head an institution which is a major player in Holocaust education, and something that goes contrary to the spirit of Yad Vashem and the spirit of tolerance and the efforts to make the world a better place by using a Holocaust education and the like.
And who is it that's been promoting him as the right candidate?
Well, officially, it's Minister Zev Elkin, who's the Minister of Higher Education, and it was his choice. But I think, this is done with the approval of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and appears to me to be an attempt to try and indicate to Eitam's electorate, which is mostly the religious Zionists, that Netanyahu has their interests at heart, even though he did not include Yamina, which is a party that really represents religious Zionists, in his current coalition.
So essentially, it's politicizing the appointment of what is a very sensitive appointment, and really it's something that politics shouldn't be playing any part in, I would have thought, in my view.
It's almost invariably impossible to prevent any degree of politics from entering decisions like this. And Yad Vashem itself is deeply involved in politics, but it's critical politics for the future of Holocaust memory and commemoration and education. Because right now, we are facing a terrible problem of Holocaust distortion in Eastern Europe. And the government has been very reluctant to bring up these issues with our Eastern European friends in post-communist Eastern Europe, because of a desire to foster that friendship and get their assistance in certain political issues concerning the EU, in which they see things differently than the Central and Western Europeans in that regard.
Yeah, well, I really want to go into a bit more depth about, obviously, about the situation in Eastern Europe. But there was just another point before we get on specifically to your work over so many years, tracking down Nazis around the world. And it's the use of the word and the term Nazi, the way it seems to be used, just scattered about. And I was very shocked at the way that in the last week or two, the son of the prime minister, Yair Netanyahu, referred to people to do with the kibbutz movement as Nazis. Now, first of all, it seems to me a ridiculous thing to say, but above and beyond that, it seems to be trivializing what a Nazi really is when you keep also sometimes where there were a yeshiva was being closed because of the coronavirus, and some of the Haredim were shouting at the police that they were Nazis. Now, does it worry you that the word Nazi is being trivialized by so many people that don't understand the depth of it?
You're 100% correct, but I want to tell you that there's a bit of a silver lining here, and I'll explain to you why. What this proves is that we, the people who have devoted our lives and other people who've devoted part of their lives to the efforts to educate the world and society about the seriousness and the importance of the Shoah have been very, very successful. In other words, we've convinced the world correctly that the Holocaust was the worst case of man's inhumanity to his fellow man, the worst case of genocide, and consequently, it's become the ultimate weapon. In other words, in any argument, people trot out the Holocaust and terms that are connected to these issues because that's the most effective weapon that they have, and with no concern for the accuracy of the accusation. So, I mean, listen, the people in PETA, the ones who are protecting animals, say that the mistreatment of animals is Treblinka. Treblinka was the second worst, most lethal death camp. The anti-abortionists say the same, that the large number of abortions is the second Holocaust. And Haredim calling our policemen, Nazis is exactly the same thing. It's all rubbish. I mean, it's a totally absurd. It has no connection to reality. And basically what it is reaching for a weapon that ostensibly will decide any argument. That is, put to rest any argument, but has no connection to reality, no connection whatsoever.
Yeah, I've got to say, I was absolutely shocked when I saw the son of the prime minister using that term to refer to people from the kibbutz movement. I thought it was just a horrible thing to do from a person who is not of the best caliber.
I think we're at the point already where there's no need or requirement to get upset about anything that the prime minister's son says. I'm talking about Yair, not Avner. Okay? Yeah. He's notorious for his ridiculous comparisons, for his unbridled attack on good people who simply don't agree with him or don't back his father. Exactly. So, I mean, don't ascribe to him more importance. His genealogy ostensibly gives him importance, but none of his achievements give him any importance or any significance.
Yes. I'm not aware of any of his achievements, actually.
Well, yeah, but not if there are any. So,
yeah. You've been involved in your profession since the late 70s. Is it that you first became involved, or even before then? When you, yeah. But of course, you don't grow up dreaming of being a Nazi hunter, I assume. You grew up in the United States, and what did you dream of being when you were a teenager?
I dreamt of being the first Orthodox Jew to play in the NBA. That was my fantasy.
And how long did that dream last?
Listen, when I didn't even start on my high school team, that was a problem already. But listen, I played in high school. I played in college. Division III, not even Division I. And listen, you can't be an Orthodox Jew and play in the NBA. But
because of the Saturday games.
It wasn't even a question. In other words, I wasn't anywhere near good enough to even be considered. So I always say that basketball's loss was Nazi hunting's gain.
Well, it certainly seems that way. But how, I know you studied history, didn't you? History is your was your
College,
base
my
subject.
major.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
believe it or not, in Yeshiva University, you could not major in Jewish history.
Okay.
The only option was general history.
Okay. And how did you become involved? What was the first entry you had into the world of trying to track down people that were accused of Nazi crimes?
The first entry was when I was in Los Angeles. I had made Aliyah to Israel in 1970. And in 1977, my PhD topic was approved. And I had to go to the States for an indeterminate amount of time to get the documentation that I needed to write a dissertation about the history of a group of rabbis, Orthodox rabbis in the United States, which established a special rescue committee, initially only to save rabbis and yeshiva students, and later to save all Jews. Mm-hmm. And during that period, I was hired to be the first academic director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, which had just been founded a year previously, in 1977. And in early 78, late 78, excuse me, I was approached by an investigator from the about to be established United States Office of Special Investigations, which was opened in order to take legal action against Nazi war criminals living in the United States. Now, the person whom they sent to speak to me was Bill Crane, an investigator from the office, a non-Jew, and he made such a wonderful impression on me, I have to say, his dedication, his interest. And I said to myself, listen, I've been studying the Holocaust intensely for the last 8 years, have an MA already. This guy is not connected ostensibly, or in terms of his family, or certainly his interest. And there must be something I can do to help him. And yeah. I came up with an idea of establishing a database of all the survivors in North America that would facilitate finding witnesses for the trials that they hoped would one day take place in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I launched this project through the Wiesenthal Center, but to be perfectly honest, it was a total failure because the Wiesenthal Center didn't want to invest any money in it, and it would have been very difficult to carry out. Yeah. But that initiative created a connection for me with the heads of the Office of Special Investigations. And before returning to Israel, I convinced them that they needed someone on the ground in Israel to be a researcher. Mm-hmm. First of all, because of the number of survivors in Israel.
Sure.
And because of Yad Vashem, which had at that point certainly by far had the most extensive documentation, the largest number of testimonies, and was the best place to do research to assist them in their investigations. Mm. So I was hired initially for 2 months, later on for 4 months, and ultimately it lasted 6 years until I left them because I discovered a way to find the immigration destinations of thousands of Nazi war criminals by cross-referencing source material with the files of the International Tracing Service. In other words, that was set up by the Red Cross after World War II. Yeah. They were getting millions of requests for information about people looking for their loved ones, relatives. And in those days, there were no databases. So this was a compilation of index cards, over 16 million index cards, 3,600 microfilms that was by 11 different countries. But the only country where there was free access to this material was Israel. And it was at Yad Vashem. In other words, if I would have written to Arelson and said, I'm looking for my father or my grandfather, first degree relatives, they would have answered me in 6 to 9 months with whatever information they had. But if I was writing to them saying, I'm working for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I'm working for the OSI, and I need information on person X, they would never have answered me at all. So this was a very, very lucky thing. And the funny part of the story is that I went for the first time into those files because I was looking for a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. And I had never used it. I assumed that if it was at Yad Vashem, it's because it was full of Jews. It was all about the Jews. But there were 11 million displaced persons in Europe after World War II, and they weren't all Jews, that's for sure. Mm. So it turned out that the material, I had the name of a certain person that I had to find, and but the material, the names were organized not according to a regular alphabet. They were organized according to a phonetic alphabet, which meant that double letters count as one letter, V and W are the same letter, I, J, and Y are the same letter.
Wow, so very confusing.
An hour to figure it out. And I knew that the people, the Nazi war criminals who had emigrated to the Western Anglo-Saxon democracies had all been displaced persons. In other words, anyone who wanted to get privileges as a refugee had to register with the Red Cross. Mm-hmm. Any person who registered with the Red Cross appeared in Arleston, had an index card, or in some cases, several index cards. So there was no indication on the cards whether any of these people was a Nazi war criminal. But I had other sources for that.
Okay.
They did have the immigration data, where they went, on what date, on what ship, and those who went to America, first address even.
Now, can I ask you, Efraim, of so many people of the war criminals, they scattered around the world, and we know obviously about South America, and there's been movies made like The Boys from Brazil and all this kind of thing. But can you tell us what would be the country that would most surprise people as having harbored Nazi war criminals? Is there a country that seems to have a reputation as being open, democratic, and doing the right thing, but actually played more than a minor role in accommodating people who had very dubious past?
I'll give you 5 countries, all of which fought against the Nazis: the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand.
Really?
All of them admitted large numbers of Nazi war criminals. America probably the most, New Zealand the least. And within less than a decade after the end of World War II, some of the worst of Hitler's henchmen were able to emigrate to these countries. By the way, 99% Eastern Europeans, not Germans or Austrians.
And did these countries knowingly let them in, or did they slip through the systems and sneak in? And what I'm saying is, did they turn a blind eye, or did they simply not know?
There's a couple of explanations here. First of all, it was clear almost from the minute the war ended that the Cold War was imminent.
Yeah.
So the Americans and the others were more concerned with stopping communists from coming in than anti-communists. And all these people were nationalists. These Eastern Europeans, they were all fascist sympathizers, very right-wing, anti-communist. And it was easier for them to get into the United States than for a Holocaust survivor. And the same.
Really?
Yeah.
That's an astonishing statement, because a lot of people wouldn't be aware of that. They would have the image, as I have had, despite the research I've done, that many countries did try and take in Holocaust survivors. But you're suggesting that in some countries, those that were fleeing their very, very dubious past were getting preferential treatment as far as entry into these democracies was concerned.
So I'll give you an example. The United States at one point, out of sympathy with the plight of the survivors, actually decided to give 250,000 visas outside the quotas, the immigration quotas. So first of all, they gave 50,000 to Volksdeutsche. Volksdeutsche, Eastern Europeans of German origin, who lived in Eastern Europe, in some cases for generations, and were the most likely people to join the Nazis. Now, you understand, and most people in the late 40s weren't even aware of this. Only in Eastern Europe did collaboration with the Nazis include participation in systematic mass murder. Mm-hmm. In other words, everywhere else, in every country, the Nazis were able to find these collaborators and enlist their help. But in Belgium, in Holland, in France, in Italy, Greece, Norway, those people were not the ones who systematically murdered their Jews. Their collaboration ended at the train station or at the port. When these people were transported somewhere else to be murdered by someone else. That somewhere else was Eastern Europe. That someone else was the Nazis and their local collaborators.
And these collaborators and these people that were involved in the killings were getting visas into the United States, UK, Australia, you name it.
You have to understand something. The overwhelming majority got through the cracks for two reasons. One is that the people in the West were not sufficiently aware of the Holocaust by bullets. They were more focused on Auschwitz, was one iconic image.
Yes.
But the camps that were liberated by the Western Allies, now there's Bergen-Belsen by the Brits, you had Mauthausen, Buchenwald, and Dachau by the Americans. They became the iconic images. There's the media reports in places like Bergen-Belsen, when you saw the piles of bodies and all that all related to crimes committed by Germans and Austrians.
Right.
And they were unable to get to what was left of Auschwitz or of Majdanek because it was behind the Iron Curtain already. They didn't get to Rumbala outside Riga, Ponar outside Vilna, Mali Trustnitz outside Minsk, with tens of thousands, Babi Yar outside Kiev, tens of thousands of Jews were murdered there by the Nazis and their local helpers. Mm-hmm. So, but I have to also explain that two groups of people were knowingly brought to the United States, despite the fact that the Americans were aware of what they had done during World War II. One was the scientists, engineers, and technicians who worked on the V2s, on the V2 rockets. The Allies were aware already from the middle of the war that Germany had technology far superior to that in the hands of the Allies. And, you know, you might know that Hitler actually thought that this would be the changer, the game changer in the war. This would bring Germany to victory ultimately. But thank God it didn't happen. But after the war, there was a mad rush by both sides, the Soviets and the Western Allies, to find these people in the famous Operation Paperclip. That's what it was called, because if someone had a paperclip on his index card, that meant that he was a target. Wow. So these people were knowingly brought to the United States, and some to Britain, I think, and maybe to Canada. But what ultimately happened was when the space programs in the late 50s, early 60s, when the satellites were launched, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, you had people who were involved in the V2s. So that's one group. That's about 150 people, if I understood correctly, knowingly brought to the United States. They went either to Huntsville, Alabama, where the Americans produced the ballistic missiles, or to NASA, to Houston, Werner von Braun, etc.
And Ephraim, America, knowing what these people had done, they waived any danger of them being prosecuted for what they'd done in the past. There was some sort of a system in place to make sure they wouldn't be prosecuted.
Only one such person. First of all, initially there was no system to specifically try Nazi war criminals. That system was only created in the 70s. But the one person was basically convinced to leave the United States. That's Arthur Rudolph, who was in charge of the Saturn satellite. But there was another group, and I'm not sure of the numbers, how many people were involved here. It was not a large group. There were people whom the CIA, or initially the OSS, then the CIA, wanted to parachute back into their native countries to serve as spies, espionage, to conduct espionage against the communists, against the Soviet Union. So these people were also given a pass in a sense. But I don't know how many. I don't think this program was particularly successful for a variety of reasons. Some of the people were caught, and I don't know all the details, but that was also another small group. But it's nothing compared to the numbers. In other words, the estimate of, when we say a Nazi war criminal, so my definition is any person who in the service of the Third Reich participated in persecution, of course, murder of innocent civilians.
Yeah.
So the estimate is at least 10,000 people entered who fit that category entered the United States. Canada, it was thousands. Australia, thousands. New Zealand, dozens. Maybe 200 or something. No one knows the exact numbers.
And the UK, where I'm from,
yeah, also hundreds.
Yeah, it's quite shocking when you hear it in those terms. But I want to just move on to last night. I finished your book. It was fascinating.
1 second before you get to that book, let me say one thing that might be helpful to those people, to the people who are interested in these issues.
Yes.
The revelation, the discovery that I made in the files of the ITS, the International Tracing Service, convinced me to leave the U.S. Justice Department, because to my great surprise, I have to say that there was almost no original documentation on the cases that were being tried in the United States in the archives in Yad Vashem. And that was the primary archives that I used. I also went to Lochmei Getot, I went to Moreshet, I went to Bar Ilan, I went to Tel Aviv University, I went to every Holocaust archive in Israel. And in the course of 6 years that I was working for them, I think I only found one document that actually mentioned by name the person who was a suspect in the United States. That was the mayor of Kovna, of Lithuania, Kazis Palchauskas. And he gave the order to put the Jews in the ghetto. And he had run away to America. So I found a document that he had signed. I'm not even sure if it was actually introduced into the trial. So what I was able to find was, of course, many survivors, potential witnesses, and a lot of background material on the crimes that had been committed. But hardcore documentation, there was almost nothing. And the reason for that is very simple, because Israel, I have to say, was obsessed with the issue of resistance by Jews.
In what respect?
In other words, the researchers who working on the Holocaust devoted an enormous amount of attention to the question of Jewish resistance. They wanted to document it. So I always used to say jokingly that if I had $1 for every testimony I read about in which the person being interviewed was asked who smuggled the first gun into the Warsaw Ghetto, I'd be rich. Okay. And if I was paid $1 for every testimony or every document in which the name of the mayor, collaborationist mayor of Kovna was mentioned, I'd be on welfare. You know, I mean, there was no comparison. Yeah. So I felt that I was helping them, and they wanted to continue. But what happened was that when I made that discovery, the only Western Anglo-Saxon country which had already decided to take legal action against the Nazi war criminals was the United States. Canada was investigating. Australia was investigating. UK and New Zealand ostensibly had no idea that they had the problem. So I realized that what I was finding here was a gold mine. In other words, after I had this eureka moment, I said, this is too good to be true. I took a list of 49 Lithuanians and Latvians who I knew were Nazi war criminals, and I found the immigration destination of 16 of them in a matter of minutes.
Really? So
I went back to the Wiesenthal Center, and I said to them, okay, guys, I had discussed with Rabbi Haya, who was the founder and the leader of the Wiesenthal Center, setting up a database of Nazi war criminals as a project. In other words, to leave the OSI, to leave the Americans, and go back to the Wiesenthal Center to work for them. And he came back to me many months later and said, you know what, I like your idea. I said, forget it. Let's go for the jugular. Okay, we're going to flood these countries with the names of suspects to force them. That was the other four or five. The other four. South Africa was closed to immigration, so they didn't have the problem. And we are going to, in a sense, convince them that they have to decide to take legal action against these people. You can't just let them live in a wonderful democracy like the UK or Canada or New Zealand or Australia. You have to take legal action against them. In other words, it's a total insult to the memory of the victims, to the survivors, to any people of goodwill. So at the time, the Louisiana Law Center didn't have an office in Israel. So I said, listen, you're setting up an office in Israel, in Jerusalem. Okay, I'm going to start churning out the lists for you, and we're going to fight these battles. And the good news is that Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, and UK in 1991. It took us 5 years to get that bill passed, by the way, in the UK. That's a whole story in itself.
Okay.
Worth 5 podcasts. All passed laws to enable criminal prosecution in those countries of Nazi war criminals. Mm. The only country that refused was New Zealand. And there the scope of the problem was much less. But okay, but it wasn't, I mean, they had a government investigation. They found people who were involved, and they refused to take the steps to take legal action against them.
Yeah,
that was a failure. But in the other countries, the passage of the bill was super important from a moral point of view, from a judicial point of view, and no matter which way you look at it, the results were paltry. I'll be honest with you; they weren't great. But think what these Nazis were thinking when those bills passed. They were shaking.
I remember when I interviewed you for the Jerusalem Reports 5 or 6 years ago. I came to your office in Jerusalem and we sat and had a conversation. And I remember you saying one thing to me that really sort of hit home. And that wasn't because I asked you about how many successful prosecutions there had been that you had been personally involved with. And I think it was about 60 or something of that number. But the thing that you pointed out was that it wasn't so much the prosecutions, you said to me, it was the fact that these people wouldn't be able to rest at night because they knew somebody was out there looking for them. And for me, that has always seemed to me to be your main driving, the driving force behind what you do, that you don't want these people to sleep easy at night. And obviously there's very few, if any, left these days, but that's been your driving force for many years.
Listen, I wanted to do as much as I could for the victims and for their families. And in some cases, what that was to ruin the lives of the people I was looking for, even if I couldn't get them into a court of law. Mm-hmm. So in other words, we had to establish the principle that justice had to be available, had to exist. In other words, in New Zealand, it didn't exist. The minute that the government said no to us, that was it. And every Nazi war criminal living there could, sit back in his chair and laugh at me. Now, that's not really true. I'm saying he could just relax and know that there's almost no chance of them ever paying for it. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget one case in New Zealand that for me is symbolic. A Lithuanian by the name of Jonas Pukas had been a member of a Lithuanian murder squad. By the way, an officer from that squad by the name of Antanas Gekas, or actually Antanas Getsevichus, whose name was changed to Anthony Gekas in England, in the UK, he's not in England, he's in Scotland, was actually the main case that convinced the British government to take legal action against the Nazis in the UK.
Okay.
And he was interviewed, and I got a transcript of the interview that a wonderful New Zealand police officer by the name of Wayne Stringer, a real tzaddik, a guy who really took this seriously, had sent to me after he retired from the force. I think he was sick, he was ill, he had to leave the force, but he had the documents and he gave them to me. And in this transcript of the testimony, Pukas said that the victims were screaming like geese. In other words, he's standing at a pit. He's just shot. He claimed not to have shot, but that's bullshit. Okay, it's clear. All those people had to shoot. And men, women, and children are being murdered for no crime other than the fact that they're Jews. And what does he see? He mocks the victims by talking about how they yelled like geese. I'll never forget it as long as I live.
Yeah. It's a tough image. I mean, I finished your book last night, and obviously I myself have done a little bit of research connected to my own family history in Lithuania and Latvia. And I find it very traumatic, even picking up a book or looking at something, well, every now and then and going through it. I find it very personal, very emotional, very hard to deal with. But you've lived with this for more than 40 years, day in, day out. How is it that you get through it and stay sane? Because it's a very, very tough thing to deal with. You tell me what it is that keeps you on the straight and narrow.
Listen, it depends how you define sane, maybe.
Yeah.
Now, listen, I'll be honest with you. The book that I wrote together with Ruta Vanagaita about Lithuania and the cover-up of the role of the Lithuanians finally got to me. That mission that we went on.
Sorry, did you think it was possible before you sent out that something could affect you? Because you've always kept a distance emotionally from the subject. No. Did you think there was a chance this could happen?
When I started as a graduate student at Hebrew U in specialization in the Holocaust, at a certain point, very early on, I realized if I don't create a wall, very strong wall between myself and this subject, I'm not going to have a life.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. And that wall protected me for 35 years. I visited places of mass murder. I visited Auschwitz, other death camps, and I was fine.
Yeah.
The mission that I went on to write the book, Our People, Discovering Lithuania's Hidden Holocaust, demolished that wall. Absolutely demolished it. And I found myself really in one of the most heartbreaking situations I ever experienced.
That came through in the book. It's an interesting book because, just to kind of set the scene, it's a book about you going on a journey through Lithuania with the famous Lithuanian writer Ruta Vanagaita, and you obviously are looking for Lithuanians that committed crimes. She was feeling that, did this really happen? Did the people really get involved? This wasn't what she'd been taught as she grew up. And at first it was quite a combative relationship the two of you had. You know, she'd heard these terrible things about this horrible Zuroff that's coming over to stir up trouble, and you were completely convinced that there wasn't a person really in Lithuania that was going to take seriously what had happened. So just put in a nutshell the initial stages of what happened and how you came to set out on this journey that is documented in this book.
Okay. You know what? I just want to say one thing before we get to this book. If anybody is interested in what we discussed previously, in other words, struggle to find the people and the political battles that we were engaged in to try and get people to governments to agree to prosecute, I wrote an entire book about this called Operation Last Chance, yes. One man's quest to bring Nazi criminals to justice. So if people are interested in the individual cases, that might interest them.
I'm sure. Okay?
But okay, this story, what happened here it illustrates the problems that we face in trying to deal initially with trying to facilitate prosecution. But that battle has now been changed because the number of Nazi war criminals is dwindling. We're still helping the Germans because in Germany they still are prosecuting. And the only reason they're still prosecuting is because of the extension of life expectancy. In other words, there are people alive who committed these crimes and are healthy enough to stand trial. Most of them live in Germany and Austria where they have good health systems and they're reaching an elderly age. And the Germans, to their credit, somewhat of a small corrective for a horrible record in prosecuting Nazis over the years, are doing it. So we're helping them. I found more than 20 survivors for the trials from Stuttgart, for example, most of them living in Israel.
Yeah.
A lot of Lithuanian Jews, by the way.
Mhm.
People survived the ghettos and then were deported to Stutthof, mostly women.
Yeah.
But in any event, the struggle has been now morphed into a fight over the narrative. Now, what basically happened was that for years, for 25 years, I fought with the Lithuanians, tried to get them to prosecute their unpunished Nazi war criminals. And the truth of the matter was that they had tremendous potential to do it because the United States had successfully deported at least 14 or 15 Lithuanian Nazi collaborators. Now, in the United States, they can't be prosecuted for the crimes because the crimes were committed overseas.
Yeah.
And were not Americans. So they were prosecuted for immigration and naturalization violations, lying on their immigration, lying on their naturalization.
Yes.
And the punishment was to lose their American citizenship and be deported. And they chose to, almost all of them chose to be deported to Lithuania. And Lithuania accepted them. So in other words, these people arrived, and there's no statute of limitations on Nazi crimes in Lithuania. They could have been prosecuted on criminal charges. And some of them were really big criminals. Alexandras Laleikis was the head of the Lithuanian security police in the Vilna district, had 100 men under his command. They're the ones who guarded the Vilna ghetto. They're the ones who took the Jews to be murdered in Ponar. 70,000 Jews were murdered. Gimžauskas was his deputy. Both of them had run away to America. Both of them were kicked out of America. But the Lithuanians did everything under the sun to ensure that they would not be punished. And
what was their motivation to do that, Efraim? Why did they do that? It seems ridiculous that these people are known Nazis. They've been deported for going into America, hiding their Nazi past. They come back to Lithuania, a country that was trying to be modern, democratic, European, and yet they just refused to do it. Except
modern, democratic, except for the issue of the Holocaust. In other words, their narrative was, this was the work of the Nazis. And we had almost nothing to do with it. If you press them, they'll say, there were some degenerates, marginal elements of our society. They're not part of us. As a matter of fact, our book, when it came out in Lithuanian, it first came out in Lithuanian, it was called Musishki. Musishki means our guys, our boys, okay? And through the letters, I can actually show it to you. Can I show it to you?
Yeah, go on. Let's have a look.
It's also actually in English, but hold on a second. Okay, so this is the Lithuanian book, okay?
Okay.
And if you look at the book, you can see two faces.
Yes.
Okay. Now, one of those is a Jew who represented Lithuania in 2 Olympics as a cyclist, or as Ruta would say, good enough to represent us, not good enough to live, murdered in the Kovna ghetto. Right. Next to him is one of the commanders of the special unit that murdered 70,000 Jews in Ponar outside Vilna.
Right.
Look at the pictures. Who's who? Can you tell?
I've been thinking about that while you're asking me, and to be honest, I'm not sure I could tell. I probably suspect that the guy on the left, as I'm seeing it, next to the letter M, is the Jewish cyclist, but I don't know if I'm right.
You're right. Okay. But it's very hard to distinguish between them.
It is hard, yeah.
So this was the message. Ruta, really, she's a genius when it comes to this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Lithuanian society says neither the victims, they were Jews, they were communists, they exploited us, they deported us to Siberia, because among the KGB people in the Russian occupation were, of course, the Jews.
Yes.
They didn't deserve our help. They got what they deserved. Okay? These murderers in Lithuanian is the only language in the world where there's a special word in the Lithuanian language for shooters of Jews, Žydų. In other words, the phenomenon was so widespread that they actually produced a name for it.
Which makes it all the more ridiculous that they try and deny the fact that such a thing happened if they're the only country with that specific word in their language.
You're right. This is the English version, okay? Mm-hmm. Our people, and the 2 photographs. But in the Lithuanian book, it's done better in terms of the artwork.
Okay. But reading the book over the last few days, at first there was this very great tension between you and Ruta, who's a very highly regarded Lithuanian writer. She's a very well-known public figure there. And she wanted to find out if any of her relatives have actually been involved in any of the killings, which is something very few people in Lithuania, Lithuanians, have ever come forward, if any, and wanted to know or document. And together you set out on this journey across the country to various sites, to places where the government of Lithuania had said, there are no witnesses, so there's nothing to investigate. We have no witnesses. And you went from place to place, and it seems that every place you went to, there were people who were still alive, had been youngsters when the crimes were committed, who gave you some incredible testimony.
Okay. First of all, I just want to explain that Ruta already knew that her relatives were involved before she met me. And it was her admission to me that her relatives had been involved that absolutely shocked me. I had never met a Lithuanian who had admitted that either a family member or a close family friend had been involved in any way. And I'd been coming to Lithuania for 25 years. I was there dozens of times. And in my life, I had two eureka moments, okay? One eureka moment was when I figured out that the ITS would lead me to thousands of Nazis that I described to you before. Yes. The other one was when she told me that, and I'll tell you why. We had already run out of suspects in Lithuania. There were no cases to push. So the debate became a debate over the narrative. What actually happened in Lithuania and who was responsible? Now, I had been telling them time after time after time, tell the truth. The truth will liberate you. You want to be a liberal democracy. You have to face the past. No one is blaming the children or the grandchildren for the crimes. It's not the Jewish way. We don't blame the descendants. We only blame the perpetrators. And nothing helped. Nothing. In no way was I successful in convincing these people of the truth.
But you admitted to me when we spoke some years ago that in hindsight you might have gone about it the wrong way, trying to sort of very aggressively go in there and try and shake them up and bring them to some sort to their senses.
Correct.
Maybe it should have been done differently, and so they were very reluctant to work with you.
No, but the point was to do it differently would have meant either that I pull out completely, and I was the only one who was doing it. So in other words, so I couldn't pull out in a certain sense. In other words, I felt I had a responsibility, even if I didn't succeed, to put the information out there. But all of a sudden it hit me, this is Ruta. She is one of the most popular, if not the most popular author in Lithuania, an ethnic Lithuanian. She admits her relatives were involved. If Ruta tells them the truth, maybe we have a chance.
Yeah. And off you went to the various sites of massacres. You spoke to witnesses from the village. There was one particular story. I'd like you to tell it from the book that really kind of took my breath away. It really shocked me. And that was the story about the gold tooth. The lady with the gold tooth. That really, Efraim, it really left me dumbstruck. And do you want to just tell that one story? I think it puts things in a nutshell.
The story is about a person who has a relatively young person, was involved in the shootings, and he took gold teeth from the victims, and he later became a dental technician. And he used that gold tooth in his profession as a dental technician. But the amazing thing was that we later found out that many dentists in Lithuania used to ask people when they wanted to give them a gold tooth, your gold or ours? In other words, people had gold teeth in their homes from the mouths of the victims.
But you met this lady who had a gold tooth, and she had it put in and knew that it had come from a dead Jew. And she still had the gold tooth in her mouth.
Right.
And for me, that was just, it took my breath away. I didn't I didn't know what to think. It said so much about the way people's mindset worked.
Listen, I'll tell you. I'll tell you two stories. Apropos, you know, I mean, this is why it was so emotionally horrible. We went in the town of Panavez, otherwise known as Panovich, okay, to the local museum. And one of the workers there, who was in charge of the media relations or PR or whatever, when I walked in, I asked him, is there any information here about the Jewish community? And close to 7,000 Jews had lived in Panovich before World War II, one of the large Jewish communities. So he said, no. So I said to him, listen, are you aware of the fact that millions of people all over the world know the name of your town? Looks at me. What? Why? Why do they know the name of my town? I said, you know the bakery opposite the bus station? That's the building of the Panovich Yeshiva, okay? Which was reestablished in Israel in 1940 when the chief rabbi was able to escape, the leader of the yeshiva. Explained to him what a yeshiva is, what they do there. They train rabbis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't know anything, never heard of it. When I walked out of the museum with Ruta, I said to her, and I said it first in Hebrew, I said, Ratzachta, Yarashta, Machakta. Now, this is a takeoff on a famous story in the book of Kings about the prophet Elijah and the king Ahab. Ahab was the king of the kingdom of Israel. And right next to the palace where he lived, there was a wonderful vineyard owned by someone named Navot. Mm-hmm. And Ahab wanted that vineyard. And Navot refused to sell it to him. So Ahab killed Navot and he took over the vineyard. And then the prophet Elijah confronted him and said to him, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta? Did you murder and also inherit? So I said to Ruta, did you murder, inherit, and erase?
Yeah.
That's one story.
Mm-hmm.
Second story was of someone we met coming out of an elderly woman coming out of a grocery store in a town called Svencionelli, which is right near where my grandfather was born. And she looked the right age to have been alive during the war. And I told Ruta, listen, go ask her what, if she remembers anything, etc. So she did. So she's told the following story, that she was in a family of two girls. She had an older sister, and they were friendly with a Jewish family, which also had two girls about the same ages. And when the measures against the Jews started, there was a very intense discussion in her family whether or not her family could save her friend. The name of the family was Bensky. It was the younger Bensky daughter. So I said to her, I had to speak through Ruta. I asked her, listen, you probably were afraid of the Germans. She goes, no, we were afraid of our neighbors. And she started crying. She started crying. Geferlach, I'm telling you, it was so heartbreaking. It was like this tremendous rock had rolled off her heart. For the first time she met someone she could tell that story to who sympathized with their pain, the pain that she couldn't save her Jewish friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's these stories are shocking, but the book is. I think it's required reading for anybody that wants to understand what was going on and the way things have been covered up. But also people, you don't have to be Jewish, but somebody like myself who had 41 relatives in Lithuania and only one survived, and you understand what they went through and how things worked out as they did. I think it's a tremendous read. It's also very engaging because it's done in a conversational style between yourself and Ruta, which I think was quite original. But just because we're going to have to wrap it up because we're running out of time, Efraim, but I wanted to ask you as regards the reaction to the book and what has happened subsequently to the book and to Ruta's career since it was published.
Okay, so the only reason this book was published in Lithuanian was because Ruta had been writing her books for the largest, most successful publisher in Lithuania. And one day she went to meet with them about this book. And her previous book had sold 50,000 copies in a country of less than 2.5 million people. It was a book of advice to women at 50. In many cases, women's lives, especially in the smaller towns and villages, people felt their lives were over already. No love, the husbands were drinking or they ran away, or you know what I mean? And the farmers couldn't farm anymore because the EU was sending subsidies instead of having them farm, and all sorts of other problems. And life was terrible, really. So she wrote a whole book about how to get your life together and understand that your life is not over at 50. And I used to walk with her in Vilna in the street, and people would come over to her and hug her and kiss her. You saved my life. You know what I mean? People,
Yeah.
she had no idea who they were, of course. Anyway, so we went to meet with the publisher, and the publisher said to Ruta, listen, you wrote such a successful book about women. Why don't you write a book about men? Because that's what Ruta used to write about. Yeah, pop psychology, elderly care, things like this. Nothing to do with history. So Ruta says to her, well, listen, I'll be happy to write a book about men, but first you're going to publish what I'm writing now. Ruta, you're already writing another book? How wonderful. What are you writing about? The Holocaust. Gott in Himmel. Are you crazy? Are you nuts? Who's going to buy a book on the Holocaust? So Ruta said to them, you want me to continue writing books for you? You're going to publish this book. So they said to her, and this was actually quite smart, on one condition, you don't tell anybody what you're writing about until the day the book comes out.
Okay.
And that was very smart because the government was totally unprepared for the publication of this book. So Ruta also, she interviewed the two most popular priests in Lithuania, Catholic priests. Lithuania is a Catholic country, and an evangelical priest. This guy, the second guy, was actually a national hero because in 1990, before Lithuania had gotten formal independence, they set up a customs station on the border with Belarus. And it was manned by volunteers. And the Russians sent a SWAT team that murdered all of those volunteers with one exception. This guy, who was shot in the spine, became paraplegic, and then studied for the priesthood and became the most popular evangelical preacher in Lithuania. And both these priests had never been interviewed about the Holocaust. And they gave all the right answers. History is important. You have to tell the truth. We have to admit what we did. Unbelievable. They came to the launch of the book, the two priests. So it was Ruta Vanagaita, the most popular author in Lithuania. Efraim Zuroff, the most hated Jew in Lithuania. The two priests in an Italian restaurant. What's going on? Well, that was the headquarters of the special unit that murdered 70,000 Jews in Vilna.
That had subsequently become an Italian restaurant.
Yeah. So, I mean, everyone was going crazy. I mean, it was like unbelievable. The initial run was of 2,000 books, sold out in less than 48 hours. Ultimately, they sold 20,000 books. Mm-hmm. And 100,000 people read it. It was the most popular book read in the public libraries in Lithuania. People waited months to get a copy. So that's the good news. But the government ultimately took revenge on Ruta. A year and a half later, she questioned whether an initiative to devote 2018 to a hero of the post-war anti-Soviet resistance was a good idea. And she had read his file in the KGB files, in the KGB archives. And she found some stuff there that made his past very questionable. She said, I don't know if it's a good idea, it's not such a good idea. Next day, her publisher announced they're taking all her books out of the bookstores. This was a day after she launched her own autobiography.
Wow, okay.
27,000 copies. So in the beginning, they said they're turning them into toilet paper. In the end, she fought, she got the books back. But at the same time, the father of Lithuanian independence, Vytautas Landsbergis, wrote an op-ed in the most important internet portal, basically saying, you have betrayed the country, why don't you go commit suicide?
Lovely.
So So she was worried. She ran away to Israel. She was living in Jerusalem for about 3 years. But ultimately now, recently, she returned. Actually, she published a second book on the Holocaust with the biggest expert on the Holocaust in Lithuania, the German historian Christoph Dickmann, which is called How Did It Happen? And Christoph Dickmann answers Ruta Vanegaita. In other words, Ruta asked the questions. Christoph is a brilliant guy. He spent 16 years on his magnum opus, the German occupation policy in Lithuania. He has the German angle. He spent a year in Israel, knows Hebrew, so he knows Yiddish, learned Lithuanian, learned Polish, I think, or Russian, and he answered the question. It's an amazing book, and it's like a real primer on how it all played out, how the Holocaust played out in Lithuania. Who made the decisions? Why did they decide now on this? Was it successful? It wasn't successful. How did they react? Unbelievable book, I'm telling you.
Well, I'll look out for that one, I'm sure.
It's coming out in English in the spring.
Okay. So spring 2021. Yeah. How did it happen? What's happened here is that we've overrun because, frankly, it's been such a fascinating conversation. But before we sign off, I want to ask you, most of the Nazis have gone. Obviously, you're very busy trying to...
Very sad that they're gone without being put on trial.
But you're trying... You're trying... I know what you say. Go on. Let's hear the line.
Thanks for the good health of Nazis.
Well, unfortunately, you can only live so long, so they've gone. But the next few years for you, I assume, is going to be about trying to defend the truth about what happened and not let history be rewritten. Just in a very quick 1 or 2 liner, just tell me what's coming up in 2021 for you on that front.
Okay, first of all, we're trying to create the tools similar to the tools that we've already created in Lithuania. In other words, the grand plan would be to have books like Musishki or Our People and How Did It Happen in other countries.
With somebody local involved in the investigation.
It has to. We have to find the local ally, the local person whose prestige and whose expertise will make those books or make this thing or make a movie, for example, convincing.
Yes.
So this is what I'm busy in Lithuania. Lithuania, in a sense, is my laboratory now. To see what works, what doesn't work. But we also need we need a lot of funding to be able to do it. So that's a big issue. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that anybody watching that wants to support your work, the website's there and the contact numbers, they can get in touch. But Efraim Zuroff, it's been, as always, a fascinating discussion and a delight to talk to you. And thanks for spending so much time with us.
Listen, to spend time with you is always a pleasure, number one. And your questions are the right questions, intelligent questions. And I'm sure the message got across. Thanks to you as well.
Well, thanks very much for now. And we'll be back with the next episode very soon indeed, with another very interesting and considerable figure from life here in Israel. Bye-bye for now.